Hi, everybody. I'm Allison Williams, the Copper Queen Library Program Services Coordinator, and I am just thrilled to welcome Becky Orozco back from travels abroad from Egypt. And Becky, as you all know, is a historian and a history professor, chair emeritus at Cochise College. Um, but also a world traveler and going around the globe to look at these beautiful places. It's just such a delight to bring these travel stories, these travelogues back to us here in Bisbee. But also from Becky's point of view, looking at the history as well as traveling in these amazing places. So Becky, thank you so much for documenting your journeys and bringing this back to us here at the Copper Queen Library. Welcome.
Thank you, and thanks. Hello to everyone. This was an exciting trip, and it's fun to tell my stories. I like to tell stories. But this was not where I originally meant to go. I had planned in January to leave for Antarctica, a trip that I had planned for quite some time, was very anxious to go, but 4 days before I was supposed to leave, I got a call from the tour company that the boat had a problem and they canceled the trip. And this was like the end of December, and I was supposed to leave January 3rd. So I was incredibly disappointed, but the tour company, and I was talking, I said, well, are you going anywhere else? Because I really wanted to go somewhere. And the one trip that they had that was leaving in the next few days, that was somewhere I had been before, but really wanted to go back to, was to Egypt. And so instead of going to Antarctica and visiting the penguins, I ended up flying first to Jordan and landing in Amman on January 12th, which was, I always kind of think of that area of Israel and Jordan as being fairly tropical, but when I got there, it was cold and wet. So looking out of my hotel room down at Amman was a cloudy, wet day. And you think of this as desert. And yes, it was very unusual for them as well to have this kind of weather. But I joined the group, and this was an incredible opportunity. My group was only 6 people and our guide. And because the tour company really wanted this trip to go, they sent it out with a very small group. And so it turned out to be just a delightful experience. You'll see there's only 5 of us there. There was one person who I'm not really sure she went along, but she really very seldom took part in our activities. So it was mostly the 5 of us. Amman originally was called Philadelphia during Roman times. It was a Roman city, a Roman capital in their far eastern provinces. And a lot of the Roman ruins Amman is built in and around Roman ruins in the old area of their sort of forum and bureaucratic area. You can still see things like the hand of Hercules. When you look at this hand and the parts of the statue around it, you can just imagine how large this statue originally was. It was a beautiful sight to wander around. It was just not far from the old Roman amphitheater, which we also got to visit. But that afternoon, the idea was that we were supposed to spend several days around Amman and then go south to Petra. But the weather report said that it was going to freeze. And it almost never freezes in Jordan, and no one knows how to drive on ice. So the country decided that they were going to shut down the highways that evening and not open them up until noon the next day. So we left that afternoon for Petra. We left for the south just so that we would be able to get on the road at a reasonable hour and get to where we were headed. So, but that we did stop, go through the local market, and the first of many markets. They were also It's so much fun to go through the markets there because of the color and the foods and just the feeling of the markets. This was the Amman market. So we headed south to Petra. And Petra is one of my favorite places in the world. Brings out my inner Indiana Jones. All of you who are old Indiana Jones fans will remember the Last Crusades as they ride into Petra. Um, and Petra, like most of the sites on this trip, because of COVID and the closures, there was almost no one there. Before, you had to line up to get into the site. This time, we had it virtually to ourselves. And walking through the canyon, these rose red canyons into the site was magical because it was just the few of us. And into the area of the treasury. I think the same camels were there 14 years ago when I was there, but the site was as fascinating as it was the last time I visited. These are the Roman tombs. Rome also held it. Petra originally was a trading site, a caravanserai for trade coming up through what is now Saudi Arabia from India and other places on the Indian Ocean. Trade would travel up to this caravanserai and then travel from there to the Mediterranean. And Petra was a rich trading site. It was well protected, and the Romans kept it going. The Greeks had it for a while, so it had a long history of all of these cultures there. So this is going into the Roman area, the Roman amphitheater at Petra. And everywhere I went, it seemed to be the time of year for the kitties to be out. So kitties, this was the Petra kitties. And as you can see, it was not a warm and sunny day. All of us were well bundled. Our guide, Nader, was not, he and I went to the market and bought cold weather clothes. I had planned for Antarctica and I had all this warm weather stuff at home, but I hadn't brought it on this trip. And so I ended up in the market in Petra before going into Petra, buying hats and gloves and scarves and all the things that we needed for cold weather. From Petra the next morning, again, we headed north back towards Amman and drove along the area. Jordan borders Israel. Israel is to the west of the country, and this is a hill overlooking the Dead Sea. And from where we're standing, Jerusalem is about 30 miles to the west, out into the far distance. We couldn't see it that day because it was kind of cloudy, but Israel is just across on the other side of the Dead Sea. And the site we were visiting there was a site, a biblical site that has a large number of pilgrims who come there. The little glowing spot on top of the hill in the distance, that's known as Aaron's tomb. And Aaron, of course, was Moses's brother. This is where, after their 40 years of wandering in the desert from Egypt, they came to the land overlooking the promised land. And Moses had been told he would not make it all the way there. And so this is where he supposedly ended his journey. They haven't found his tomb, but Aaron's tomb is on that hill. And there is a church there at it's called Mount Nemo overlooking the promised land, and it's a Franciscan monastery. The Franciscan monastery has been there for almost 2,000 years. The interior still has, you can see the long history there in the ruins that still are part of the church, the new church that's been built there, and the incredible mosaics that inlay the ancient floors of the church on Mount Nemo. From there, we headed back to Amman, and from Amman, we went north to visit the city of Jerash, another Roman capital. And this is one of those kind of hidden gems. It's an amazing site, beautifully preserved. It was settled by the Emperor Hadrian about 200 AD, and it's just a great place to walk through. It's also a place I visited my last trip. Here's me on the left when I was there in January, and on the right is me in 2000, and I think it was 2006 when I was there the last time. So I think I still have that hat, but anyway. This is the forum area in the major central area of the city. Just a nice place to wander. And there's our little group. Once again, the 5 of us and our guide, Nader. The next morning we flew to Cairo. And this trip, this is the trip from their brochure. The arrows, we actually did the opposite direction of the arrows, but we started in Cairo, flew south to Aswan, and then traveled out of there, and then traveled north along the Nile from Aswan. So that was our starting point. But flew into Cairo, and Cairo again was unseasonably wet and chilly, but we had a beautiful hotel on an island in the middle of the Nile. It was a Marriott now, but it was a palace that was built and has served as living quarters for a number of the leaders of Egypt through the years. And so this was the view from my window looking down on the Nile. And our first day, we visited the famous museum, the Cairo Museum. This is just an absolutely astonishing place. It is just that has been filled with millions of artifacts over the years that have been excavated in all the sites around Egypt. But it's in the middle of great change because they're building a brand new museum out by the pyramids. And this museum is slowly being moved to the new museum. It still has more artifacts than you could ever imagine. This is our new guy, our guide in Egypt. His name is Hassan, and Hassan is an archaeologist. And so he and I had a great time talking archaeology. This is one of the few remaining tombs in the museum, but lots and lots of empty cases. Many of the items that people go to this museum to see, like the artifacts from King Tut's tomb, had been moved, are in the process of being moved. And so there was lots of empty cases. King Tut, his mummy case was there, but most of the other artifacts were gone. So we look forward to, I'll have to go back to Egypt in a few years to see the new museum, I guess. But this is what the interior is like now. There were a number of areas where there's still artifacts, and they were in the process of getting them ready for the move, doing a lot of restoration and cleaning work as they prepare to move them to this huge new museum out by the pyramids. And it's supposed to open in November. It was supposed to open last year and then the year before that. And I think the original dates was in 2019, but sometime it will open. So this was the beginning of a trip, of course, that was focused on Egyptian archaeology, the 3,000 years of the Nile being the focus of people living in Egypt. And Cairo lays right next to the ancient capital at Giza, where the first pyramids are built, or the major pyramids are built. So we headed out there on the second day, but Cairo itself is this mix of super modern. We were driving along a 8-lane freeway that most people didn't pay much attention to the lane markings. It was probably 10 and 12 lanes most of the time, but also along the edge of the freeway were all kinds of things like the cattle and bicycles and all kinds of other vehicles. We went first to Saqqara, and Saqqara, when I got the information on the tour, wasn't on the tour. And Saqqara is where the oldest pyramids are. These are pyramids that were built about 3,500 years ago in the first dynasties. And it's where many of the new finds are being developed. And, I think if you read the paper earlier this week, they just uncovered 5 new tombs at the site of Saqqara. So I asked the guide, I said, well, what about Saqqara? And he says, well, it's not on this itinerary. But if you might have some time, and if you want, I'll arrange a taxi to go out there for you. This was when I talked to him on the phone before I went on the trip. But by the time I got there, he had arranged a trip out there for all of our group. So we got to go to Saqqara as a group on our first full day in Cairo, the second day we were there, and visit this first tomb, the first pyramid. And this was when they really hadn't figured out the construction, all the construction methods. This one is a stepped pyramid, and this kind of looks like pyramids you'd see anywhere in the world. If you need to build a big building and you don't have structural steel or concrete, this kind of stepped pyramid is what you will build. So this was the first one. Their second one was a bent pyramid, and you can't see it here because the smog was so bad that day. The moisture in the air and the smog around Cairo made it so it was very difficult to have very good visibility. but we could see it in the distance. That one they built and it kind of collapsed. And then they built the famous pyramids at Giza. But it was a wonderful day to wander around. There were again, almost no tourists there. And we visited a number of the tombs that Saqqara is famous for. Much of the work that is being done in Egypt now that you read about continually are these wonderful tombs that are being uncovered there. This is the Menare tomb, and inside the beautifully preserved carvings and paintings on all the walls. This was my favorite just because I loved all the animals and the birds and the trees in this particular panel. From there, we drove over to the famous pyramids. This is the second pyramid, the pyramid to Khufu, the most famous, the one that you see. And if you watched Death on the Nile, this figured in that particular movie. And we could climb up onto the pyramid. And again, when I was there 16 years ago, there were thousands of people around and on the pyramid. And this was the crowd that was there that day. Excuse me. So normally, the last time I went into the pyramid, you kind of go down to a long tunnel passageway where you kind of bent over. You have to bend over and then climb up into the central part of the pyramid to the tomb. This time, no one else in my group wanted to do that. And tunnels and tombs were the one place where I felt a little bit nervous about COVID protocols, because they were packed with people in damp, closed places, and and many people were not wearing masks. So this is our group up on the side of the pyramid at the entrance after we climbed up that far, then climbed back down and went around to the other side where the famous Sphinx is located. I think this scaffolding that's on the side there where they're doing some repair work, I think that's the same scaffolding that was there when I was there 16 years ago. But the picture of the Sphinx with me in the foreground, I think was my granddaughter's favorite picture of the ones that I sent her while I was on the trip. The police at Cairo, the park police, all were riding camels. I thought that was pretty cool. Difference between here and there. From there, the next morning, we flew south to Aswan Dam, to the town of Aswan, and went out to visit the dam. And those are my dam dogs. In the distance, you can see the stylized papyrus statue. And this dam represented, in the 1960s, was Abdel Nasser, as he kind of played the United States against the Soviet Union and got them to fund the building of this major dam on the Nile River. It now provides a huge amount of water for irrigation. It changed the pattern of the Nile and the flooding that had restored soils along the Nile in the past, but it opened up big new areas for agriculture in the desert to the west. That's the Nile flowing out of the base of Aswan, and the Aswan Dam produces a large portion of the electricity that is used in Egypt today. We took a boat across the Lake Nasser to the old site of Philae, and this was our boat guide. He was 12 years old, and this was his full-time job, but he knew a lot about the archaeology and the history of the area. Philae Temple is one of the many ancient sites that would have been flooded by the filling of the Lake Nasser, but they disassembled it and moved it up onto an island that appeared that still was above water in the flooding of the Nile. And when the lake, as the lake rose, they moved 21 sites that would have otherwise been underwater for the future. And this Philae Temple is one of them. Philae Temple is like a lot of the temples, especially the later temples. Most of these temples have kind of a common theme, and that common theme built by the various pharaohs. You know, there were a number of, there were more than 20 dynasties. The last dynasties were they were the Greek dynasties led by Greek rulers, and Philae Temple is one of those. It dates to about 200 BC. And the the temple, most of these temples will have a common theme, and that is that the pharaoh is trying to show his relationship to the gods and what a good military ruler he is. And so I don't know if you can kind of make out, this is the pharaoh. He's got his hand raised with a mace, and he's holding the hair of the people he is conquering. But the site itself in the middle of the lake was just a beautiful spot to wander around. It is fairly, because they reconstructed it, they tried to put it back exactly as it was before they moved it up, but it is in remarkable shape for being 2,000 something years old. The place we stayed in Aswan is called the Old Cataract Hotel. And if you have watched Death on the Nile, Agatha Christie, the author of the book, wrote it at this hotel, or wrote parts of it at this hotel. And this is where she stayed when she was in Egypt. Her husband was an archaeologist and was working in this area. And that's where it's just could not have gotten a whole lot better than staying in this historic hotel overlooking the Nile River below, in a beautiful big kind of palatial room, and watching birds. It was pretty cool. This is the Agatha Christie suite. You can see her name on the door there, beautifully preserved and restored from her work there. And then, of course, sunset overlooking the Nile. The next day, we crossed over the Nile, and this is looking out from our hotel. The tomb on the hill here is the tomb of Aga Khan. And Aga Khan was actually an Indian ruler in the 50s who came to Egypt for his health and eventually decided to be buried there. And so that's his tomb on the hillside. And this is where we took our sort of mandatory almost camel ride in the desert in Egypt. That was my camel. His name was Isis. I don't know why I do this every time I go to the desert, because riding camels is a very difficult and uncomfortable way of transportation. When they get up, it feels like you're going to completely fly off forward, and then their gait is a little interesting. But there's me on my camel as I get ready to ride across the desert. And where we were going was to a monastery that dates to the early Christian times. This dates to about 300 AD, one of the first monasteries in the early Christian era. And Egypt played a big role in early Christianity. It had a strong presence there in the early centuries of the modern era. This particular monastery was a place of pilgrimage. It's called St. Stephen's, and a lot of it is made out of adobe. Adobe being the material of the desert. So my project here at Camp Naco is all adobe. So this was a fun place to look at how they face the issue of preservation. Back in Aswan, we did another trip through the marketplace. Again, beautiful fruits and vegetables, lots of people wandering around. And there, as we wandered around Aswan, I saw this kitty cat sitting in a window. And I posted this on my Facebook page, and a friend and artist here in Bisbee, Gretchen Bear, most of you know Gretchen, then painted the kitty from the picture that I sent. So I'm sharing her rendition of my Nile kitty. From there, we were in Aswan that day, and there was we had some free time that afternoon. And so that was an afternoon I decided I would kind of set out on my own. And it reminded me about why I like tours, because doing things on my own is a little challenging at times. I took a taxi to the quarry where the obelisks and the granite for much of the statuary in Egypt comes from. It was quarried here and then floated down the Nile to the various sites along the Nile River, the archaeological sites. You can see there a part of an obelisk that was in the process of being quarried, and it cracked in the middle, and so they kind of abandoned it there. And you can see the crack they tried to repair, but it didn't work, and so they ended up just leaving it in situ. And I loved seeing it, walking around it, but without the guide there as sort of a buffer, the people who were absolutely desperate for tourism to get going again in Egypt sort of mobbed me, and I ended up paying a number of bribes just to get out of the site. So anyway, from that day, the next day we drove south from Aswan along the side of Lake Nasser to the south, to almost to the very border with uh, uh, the Sudan. And you can tell that from, I'm sure you can all read that in the sign that I took, the traffic sign as we drove southward. This is looking out across the Sahara to the west. And this is basically what it looks like for the next 4,000 miles. The Sahara is fairly unbroken going west from the Nile. Out of Egypt, that is not water, it's a mirage, but it did show up in my photo. And then in that is where the evidence of all of that agriculture that is happening as a result of the water being taken from Lake Nasser. And those of you who live here in Cochise County recognize the crop circles that we have all up and down, like the Sulphur Springs Valley. What is growing here is wheat. And Egypt is trying to get back to its status that it had early on as sort of the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. So a lot of wheat being grown in these big crop circle areas in the desert along Lake Nasser. We got to the Abu Simbel that night in time to go out to see the site for their sound and light show. It is an astonishing site. And again, one of these sites that was to be flooded with the flooding of the lake, Lake Nasser. And so they took apart this site and moved it up on the hillside above the lake. And it's an absolutely amazing accomplishment. The site itself is astonishing, but the fact that they moved it and put it back in exactly the way that it had been before is also amazing. In the doorway that you see here between the statues of Ramses, 2 days a year, the sun shines in through that doorway and lights up the interior of the temple. So when they move the temple, they set it up on exactly that same axis, so that on those 2 days in June, the midsummer sun comes right through into the interior of the temple. This is the temple of Nefertari, Ramses's wife. These date to about 3,350 years ago. And this is it the next morning when we went back. You can kind of get a feeling of the scale. This is, you look down, well, these guys are enormous. This is a doorway at the base of the statue, or the doorway down below is a big doorway. It's probably 10 feet high. And that gives you a bit of scale for the statues. And of course, Ramses was probably the greatest of the pharaohs. It's covered with stories of his conquering of various peoples. These are conquered peoples, the names of their cities, and the cartouches above. You could see the kind of differing facial characteristics and the fact that these guys are all bound and kneeling is part of that conquest feeling. And there's Ramses with his mace, smiting his enemies, bringing them under control. He did conquer more of that Nile drainage area well into Israel and other areas of the Mediterranean while he was king. I loved the Horus statue, the falcon, who was everywhere, and it was while we were at Abu Simbel that I got to see a Barbary falcon flying overhead. This is the Temple of Nefertari, and it's in a smaller scale, but you can see how big the statues are that I'm standing in front of. Inside was a carving to Hathor, the goddess Hathor, but I thought she and I had kind of the same hairstyle going on there. So that fit in. On the way back, we stopped at a livestock market along the highway going north. All kinds of livestock being sold there, lots of sheep, cows being put into backs of pickup trucks. We saw sheep being tied up and put on the front of a motorcycle, and then of course camels. The camel has one leg tied. That's how they hobble them. They need all four of their legs to be able to move very, very far, very fast. If they put them in the back of a pickup, they tie both front legs because then they can't stand up to get out. The camel had a really nice smile. I Not sure what his real temperament was, though. But anyway, any kind of livestock that you can think of was in this market. It covered a number of a big area, and all of the kind of tack that you would need to use with livestock was also for sale there. We got back to Aswan, and then we boarded our boat. This is the Dahabeya, or small sailing vessel, traditional sailing vessel that we would be on for the next several days, floating, going north on the Nile, flowing towards the Mediterranean. It was a pretty amazing experience having this whole boat. There was, again, only 6 of us, and it was a beautiful trip. Another one of those that doesn't get much better than this moments of sitting as we sailed along with my beer in hand. It's pretty nice. And then waiting in the Nile itself. People often swim at this particular spot, but the water was way too cold to do more than just kind of do the traditional wade. We stopped at sites every day along the Nile. And again, because it had this key role in Egyptian archaeology and history, every little way there is a temple to a various ruler. This is Komombo. It's another one of the Ptolemaic temples that dates to the later Egypt period. This was the 7th through the 9th of the Ptolemaic emperors, but also beautifully carved and full of these stories, again, showing that the king, the pharaoh of that time, has relationships to the gods and is good at smiting his enemies. It was at Komombo that we met this family. They were out for an outing, and our guide was great at getting people to talk to us. The woman in this family spoke some English, and she told us all about her kids and where they went to school. They were out on a holiday walking through the ruins, and it was just kind of a nice visit. Other visits that we made along the way was at this shop where the workman there, you can see that he's working on a palm frond. In the background, what he made were crates, boxes for shipping fruit, mostly mangoes, because they need a lot of air around them. And they say these work much better than any modern materials for making the crates for shipping the mangoes. But you can see he's holding the frond to drill the holes to make the side pieces for the crate with his feet. And he was using his feet with as much dexterity as his hands in making these crates. And I brought back a small sample of his work. This was all done by hand as we were sitting there, as he showed us how he made the work and did the work. We also stopped at this woman's household, a family household. You may not recognize me in my get up there, as I try to learn how to make the Egyptian bread that was the common bread in that area. It is kind of like a big tortilla made in much the same way, much the same texture. If you think of those great big tortillas they make in Sonora, very thin, worked again and again. But once they get it flat, they would then, they folded it. And I was not very good at folding it. I tore it in several places, but then they grill it, bake it on top of a hot stone, and use it usually with a dip of molasses, because they grow a lot of sugar cane in that area as well. We also got to ride, as we left the boat, in various kinds of transportation. This little tuk-tuk took us into the ruins that I showed you at Komombo, but we also rode a horse-drawn carriage and other kinds of transportation to get to the sites and the people that we visited along the river. This is a Edfu, another of the temples, shows much of the same themes that we've seen in the previous temples. It dated to the bridge, that kind of bridge between Greek and Roman times, as Rome was beginning to expand across the Mediterranean. This is inside the side, the columns there, and the exterior, again, the god Horus. And this site is one that is all right at that bridge between the Roman times and the time of the arrival of Christianity in Egypt, and many of these tombs from that, or these sites from that area, because of Christianity wanting to downplay the iconography, the mythology that Egypt had. We see there's a lot of damage where the gods, the faces of the gods, are knocked off of their statues, and that was the case in Edfu, the Edfu temple. Esna was also a late temple. This one had incredible color inside. The paintings were still in remarkable condition. They were in the process of doing a restoration work here, but the stories of the gods and of the pharaohs were beautifully painted on the inside of this temple. More markets along the way. We would stop each day and buy fruits and vegetables for eating for dinner and various meals on the boat. One of the major meals we had was a fried cauliflower dish. And the cauliflowers, you can see, were like big as basketballs. They were huge and a common part of our diet there. This was our last night on the boat, last sunset on the Nile. And the next day we arrived in Luxor. Again, one of the capital cities that was created along the Nile. This was the sort of middle kingdom. The 18th, 19th, 20th dynasty had Luxor as their temple, or as their city, their capital. And it's there that you see these long avenues lined with sphinxes in recognition of the gods. Luxor temple is amazing. It is the largest temple complex in Egypt. It covers 65 acres. And this is one of the Ramses, again, statues of Ramses. I should have put in a picture of me in front of it or people in front of it for scale. People did not come to the bottom of the base of this statue. That's how it gives you an idea of how large it is. It was the major temple area for a number of different pharaohs, so there's lots of different areas, sites that are dedicated to the dynasties of kings that dated to that time period. And this is looking back towards the site, and two of the obelisks that would have been carved at that quarry that I visited earlier, floated down the Nile and erected here at Luxor. If you've been to New York City or to Paris or to London or to Rome, you may have seen one of the various obelisks there that were taken from Egypt, and many of them came from this particular site, were taken during colonial times by the English and the French and sent out to various places around the world. This is one of a obelisk to Queen Hatshepsut. Excuse me. Queen Hatshepsut. It's one that has fallen down, but you can see other of her obelisks in the background. And then that night we went down the road to watch the light show at another of the temples of Luxor. This is again, statues of Ramses and the other pharaohs across the front, right at sunset. It was a beautiful way to a beautiful time to visit this site. It was about a mile from where our hotel was, and it was a lovely walk to get there as well. The next morning, got up early and took a hot air balloon, another bit of transportation, out over out to the west bank of the Nile, where we flew over sites like, this is the Ramses temple on that side, and in the distance, the temple to Hatshepsut, where we would be visiting later in the day. This is also an area where a huge amount of archaeological work is going on right now. A month or so ago in all the newspapers, there was a story of them opening a new city, a new town of workmen along the Nile River, and it was at this site that that particular city was found. We went, there's Queen Hatshepsut's temple. Queen Hatshepsut was the one woman who, there were several women who served as regents during the time of the pharaohs, but Hatshepsut was married to a pharaoh who died, and she had a very small son, and that son she decided was too young to really rule. And so she had herself declared pharaoh, and she's often shown with a beard in pharaoh garb. She made herself They fully reigning pharaoh for about 20 years. When her son came along and finally came to power, her stepson, or her son, he wasn't too happy with her rule. He tried to erase her, but many of her temples and works are still standing. And this is her temple there. It's a beautiful carved into the side of the mountain. The preservation of the paint inside because of the dry climate is astonishing when you think that this is over 3,000 years old. And the archaeological team that's working there is a team from Poland. They've been doing work on the outside of her temple for several years. On the other side of the mountains, we drove around to the Valley of the Kings. And, early on, they built these big pyramids and they put their tombs inside the pyramids. And then they got looted because everybody knew where the tombs were. So by the Middle Dynasties, they started burying them in this remote valley, the Valley of the Kings, the tombs that are located there. And it's there that the tomb of King Tut, of Tutankhamun, was found. It was found in 1923, just about 100 years ago, by an archaeologist named Howard Carter. And Howard Carter had heard there was rumors that there were still tombs, but they thought all of them, even though they had hidden them away, that they'd been looted. But this was a tomb of a king, King Tutankhamun, whose reign was relatively short. He reigned from the time he was 12 to the time he was 18. He came into the kingship at a time of great change. His father had tried to change the religion to a monotheistic religion, had tried to change where the capital was located. So when he died and King Tutankhamun came to power as pharaoh, the powerful religious leaders at the time went back to the old gods. And King Tut, there's some rumors, of course, that he was encouraged in his demise at an early age so that one of those leaders could take his place. But King Tut's tomb was the one intact tomb that has been excavated there. And his is the only mummy still intact there, or more or less intact. Howard Carter, when he found it, tried to pry it out of its sarcophagus, and he got a little bit broken up in the process. This is the interior where the sarcophagus is located, and the murals on the walls indicate the life of King Tut. And it's just astonishing, the richness of this tomb. And this was a very minor king. So the king, well, you can just imagine what the other tombs for major guys like King Ramses II would have been like. And Ramses II's tomb is there as well. We visited a number of other tombs. They rotate them because too many people in them, too many people breathing in the tombs causes moisture buildup and mold to grow. And so they only open 3 of them a day, and they rotate through the tombs that are in the Valley of the Kings. But they also had amazing artwork, beautifully preserved paintings and sarcophagi. This is Anubis, the god of death, in one of the tombs there, and a series of helpers to help the departed into the next world. From there, we drove to the statues of another pharaoh, Meneses, and this is the statues that the Shelley poem, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on me, ye mighty, and despair," was written in as an ode to these particular statues. From there, we ended up back in Cairo, flew north, got to Cairo the next morning, and went back to the same hotel overlooking the Nile. And from there, we headed north we spent the day around Cairo in the old section of the city. And this is an early monastery in the city, again, from that early Christian period. And this is built on the site that is traditionally believed to be where Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus ended up when they fled to Egypt during the purge by Herod. And this monastery has been there as a seat to the Coptic religion since that time. Cairo too had a foggy, wet period then, again, something not people were not used to in this desert area. But we drove north the next day towards Alexandria and stopped at several of the desert monasteries along the way. This desert monastery has long been the seat for the Coptic Christian religion, the Coptic Catholic religion, and a number of their popes, their leaders, are buried there. They have a new location in Alexandria now, but this is the historic site of a number of the saints of the Coptic Catholic religion. And these are the tombs to those leaders. And of course, a couple of tomb kitties. In Alexandria, we were right on the edge of the Mediterranean, and Alexandria, of course, was built during the time of the after Alexander. Alexander came to Egypt, had himself declared pharaoh, then went off to conquer the rest of the known world at the time, died on his way back, and his kingdom was divided up four of his generals, and one of his generals was Ptolemy, and Ptolemy was the beginning of the Greek rulership of Egypt. And Alexandria was where he seated his capital. So this final of these Egyptian capitals at the very mouth of the Nile. Our hotel was a beautiful old resort hotel on the Mediterranean, kind of outside of town, but it turned out it was kind of in the middle of a construction zone as they're rebuilding areas around it. So it was difficult to get into and out of. Our bus actually got lost twice, but it had a great view, but it was a long way from anything. But we spent a lot of time in Alexandria. Alexandria itself was a place where it kind of became very evident about Egypt's ties to other places in the world. Most of the taxis in the city were Ladas, the Russian-made automobiles, and many of the others had brand names that I never recognized, and it turns out that they were made in China, in mainland China. So different kinds of trade patterns into Egypt itself. We visited the Alexandrian Library, and I sent Allison an email from here because it's such an amazing library. When Alexander and his followers, the Ptolemies, were in Alexandria, they had a library, and it was in it they collected copies of every known, or the originals and copies of all the manuscripts that they could get their hands on. It was destroyed during the Roman times, but they've rebuilt a new library on the site of this old library. And you can see here the modern Alexandrian Library, and its equivalent would be our Library of Congress. It has more than 5 million volumes, and they have a very active digitization program going on. This is the interior of the library. Again, not many people here at the time. If the machine down here is an ancient printing press, one of the first ones in Egypt, but thousands of workstations for people who come here to study Egyptian archaeology. And in the modern digitization, what they've done is create virtual reality models of the mummies. And so you can look at the mummies and unwrap them, see what the skeletons look like, see what their health problems were, see what artifacts were found in them. It was really a cool place to look at archaeology. From there, we drove east to the town of Rosetta, or Rashid as it's known now. And Rosetta is known for a stone that came out of there. And this is a copy of that stone, the Rosetta Stone, that was taken during Napoleon's failed conquest of Egypt. And it was the stone that had on it the Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Egyptian modern Demotic language, and Greek. And it was what was used to be able to decipher the hieroglyphs by a guy named Champion in the 19th century. And this is the niche in which it was found in that Rosetta fort. The fort itself, much of the stonework in the fort is old parts of early temples and tombs from the pharaonic times. This was in the 1800s when Napoleon was attacking there. Of course, the Rosetta Stone today is in the British Museum. Napoleon lost it in a battle as he was sailing back to France. The British took it, and it's in England now. From there, out from Rosetta is the very mouth of the Nile. This is looking at the very outflow of the Nile into the Mediterranean. So we had traveled the length of the Nile all the way from the Sudanese border to its outlet on the Mediterranean. There's our group on our final journey. It's also the place where the boat building capital of Egypt is today. There, and many of the yachts that have been seized in the last few weeks from the Russian oligarchs were constructed here in this area of Egypt. Inexpensive labor, big shipbuilding yards that are focused on these mega yachts that are being built today. Back through another series of markets, another market kitty at the fish market. This booth of meat is camel meat. Much of the meat that we saw there was camel. Most of the camels that are raised in Egypt today are for meat, and then one of the ducks in the market as well. A final Roman temple, Roman amphitheater in Alexandria. Alexandria was also the Roman capital till about 600 AD. One of the things that this trip was interesting about was security. And if you think about Egypt, probably many people remember a few years ago, there was an attack on a tourist bus at Luxor, in which a number of tourists were killed in a terrorist attack. Well, for this trip, one of the things when we were not on the boat, we had security with us. And the back facing us with the large firearm was our personal guard who rode on all of the buses with us, traveled with us everywhere. And the buses themselves were guided by a police car. A series of police cars were always with us when we were on the road. They were kind of handy because the traffic in Egypt is crazy. And these guys would get in front of the bus and block traffic so we could make turns and corners. But it was a little bit disconcerting in the beginning. Our guard with us, a guy named Leonis, turned out to be a really nice guy and would walk with us through the markets and talk to us, and it was fun. And there's my final temple kitty on our last day before my return to the US. And that's my story. So questions, comments? Let me see if I can get away from share screen.
Thank you, Becky. And personally, thank you for the library at Alexandria, one of the, mythological almost libraries that it's such a treat to see it in its modern form. And so modern at that. That's just incredible to have that contrast between that early printing press and the VR AR for research. It's phenomenal. I really, really appreciate that. I would love to open it up for questions and comments if anybody
Well,
wants to unmute.
I do want to make one comment. I see that one of my fellow travelers, the couple of the Schechter the Schechters, Bill and Claudia, were with us. And I see that Bill has joined us. I sent him the announcement. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Bill.
Bill and Claudia, you guys are muted, but yes, it's good to see you again.
Yes, we love the presentation, Becky.
Yeah.
Would you like to add anything, any of your favorite moments or insights?
You're mute again.
One of the things that was a little bit disconcerting in Cairo and to some extent in Alexandria, drivers at night never used their headlights. And I thought that was the most unusual thing I'd ever seen, is to try to drive around a busy city with no headlights on at night.
And yet,
I think for me, one of the most exciting things was that Becky talked our guide into bringing us to Saqqara, and we entered a tomb where in the 4 rooms, every aspect of life was carved into the walls, from fishermen to jewelry makers to farmers to other kinds of vendors. It was just an amazing, amazing place. And we would never have seen that had it not been for Becky. but we'll let others talk about it now. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for sharing with us and joining this presentation. That's really special. Would anybody like to unmute?
I have a, this is Cato. Becky, thank you so much. I mean, wow, what I'm overwhelmed. What an amazing place. One of the things that struck me though is that how are they able to do so much of that construction in such amazingly arid areas? Where do you think that they got their water?
From the Nile.
But that far away though?
Well, but no, if you remember back to my first map, the whole of Egypt is that tiny little narrow band along the Nile.
Yeah.
And all of the construction is within a very short distance of that, of the Nile River. The Nile was the reason for Egypt. And the Sahara on both sides protected Egypt, protected that little band of civilization along the Nile. And the flooding of the Nile made it so agriculturally productive that they were able to feed themselves and nearly the entire Mediterranean area. But also that flooding meant that for 3 months of the year, the fields were underwater. So during those 3 months, all of those farmers went to work building for the various pharaohs. That was their flood time job. And you notice most of those big temples aren't in the farmlands. They're outside of the farmlands in the desert on the edge.
Okay, so they're close enough to the river so that they were able to access that water while they were building. It just looked like they were in such a remote and arid area. Okay.
It is on both. You get a mile away from the river on each side, pretty much, and you're out into the desert.
Yeah.
But that very rich band of land along the river made it possible for that civilization to flourish for 3,000 years, virtually unchanged. I mean, the religion of the beginning pharaohs is very similar to what the Greek Ptolemaic leaders were following when they were doing it 3,000 years later.
Amazing, amazing. All right, great. Thanks, Becky.
Yeah.
Hey, can you hear me? It's Joan.
Yes,
Hi, Joan.
Hi. I love those kind of big buildings. I think those are like really, really wonderful. So thank you for taking me up close and personal to those buildings. That was really fun. I like that part.
Yeah.
Just
Well, and
amazing.
it's so amazing to see them. But there, when you look at them, and people think that they must have had, aliens and spaceships to help them move those rocks. But you think about they had the basic tools that we still use to move big stuff today, pulleys, they had rollers, and they had people, thousands of people who would come during those months to move things. And I think back to when I use this story often. When I lived in Guatemala, I would go to religious processions where men would carry statues. And some of those statues weighed 8 to 10 tons with their bases and all of that. And 100 men would carry it. And they would walk for a little ways, and one man would step out and a new man would step in, and they would have poles under it. Well, they moved a lot of the rocks in the statuary in Egypt the same way. And you see them floating the rocks floating the big pieces down the river. You see them in the carvings, like Claudia said, those parts of everyday life. How they did this is in the pictures on the walls.
That's so interesting. I when I was in Bali, I got to go to a funeral. One of the kings of one of the 6 provinces or 5 provinces had died, and so a royal funeral was a very rare thing to attend. And it was just like that in Bali. They carried these massive pyres on with 100 men with big bearers, like sticks carrying these giant towers, the funeral pyre and some other things. I never put that together this way. I also wanted to thank you for the Agatha Christie moment as well, because I don't know about the rest of you. I mean, I was obsessed with Egyptian mythology when I was very young, but I also read every Agatha Christie novel there was by the time I was 11 or 12. And then the movies, Death on the Nile in particular. And so I've always wondered if this is my vision of Egypt is formed by Agatha Christie, and the interpretations of her stories, but of that story. But to really see that she was there with an archaeologist partner, and imbued her fiction with this very real sense. Perhaps that's why it does feel so living, so real.
Well, and it was so much fun to be there. And as we, and the evenings on the boat, on the Nile, on the Dahabea, we watched Death on the Nile as one of the movies that we watched. So it
How
was
funny,
fun.
how funny.
That's
Good
fantastic.
for you.
Yeah. So,
Hey,
I mean, I
hey,
have not
Becky,
seen the
this
new
is
version. I need to do that, but I just haven't got to Sierra Vista to see it yet.
oh, new version. Hi, Becky. This is Karen. Loved all of it. Loved all your pictures. Thank you so much, and the kitties. But I'm wondering if the new dam in Ethiopia is having any effect on the flow of the Nile yet.
Probably. Yeah, they were just beginning to stop to fill that new dam in Ethiopia. It is a huge political
Yeah.
argument right now in Egypt about that. And Ethiopia, what this kind of sticking point is that Ethiopia wants the dam up and running. They're using it not for irrigation, but for electricity, for hydropower. Egypt wants them to continue to allow almost as much water to flow through the Nile to keep their water supplies where they are now. But Ethiopia wants to cut off nearly all the flow to fill up their dam as quickly as possible. So that argument was going on. Ethiopia is in the process of filling the dam. They are still letting water through, not as much as Egypt wants. Once the dam is full, there's probably not going to be a whole lot of difference about the amount of water in the Nile. But it's this filling time and the years that it's going to take. What Ethiopia wants 2 years, and what Egypt wants 10 years to fill up that reservoir behind the dam. So.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it was a topic in a lot of conversation.
I had a question. Well, I had several questions, but one, you mentioned the Adobe Church 300 AD, I think.
Yes.
That you were also looking at how they are doing those repairs and preservations in relation to Camp Nako. And what kinds of things like did you see or learn about that? That's really fascinating.
Well, they have an advantage in that they don't have much rain, and so they have a drier climate and it's better preserved. But what they face is, right now there's not much tourism because of COVID. But during the time when tourism is there, hundreds of people go through that site on a daily basis. And just the movement of people on this old adobe that doesn't have any kind of internal framework. So what they're doing is sort of shifting people through various parts of the site. They don't have a long-term preservation plan particularly for that particular site, but other sites that we visited along the way do. And so I think that basically what it showed me was that first, big adobe sites do have that tourism potential, but that making sure that you take into effect how people are going to visit it is a key part of preservation for the future.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question or comment? How about that air balloon ride? Have you done that before? Or at first I thought, wait, where did she get that picture? Um,
I was in another balloon.
oh my gosh, that's amazing. Have you done that before or?
I have a couple of times. I actually did take that ride when I was in Egypt the last time. And I did one in the Serengeti in Tanzania. That was fun. I've also did one in Turkey over Cappadocia. Only 3 of us went that morning. I think Bill and Claudia slept in. But it was fun.
Becky, what was the name of the tour group?
It's called Overseas Adventure Travel. They're the ones that I've traveled with for years. And this, they have a focus. They're really good. Well, first for women travelers, single women travelers, they have a focus there. But they also have a focus on these small groups. They're more affordable than some of the other big companies, and they have that focus on meeting local people. And so we visited a number of families. We went to dinner at people's houses. And that's one of the parts I like best about this particular company.
I mean, it just seems like a spectacular way of traveling with these various modes of traveling: camel, boat, air balloon. Oh my gosh, and great guides. So yeah, good. I'm glad, the Antarctic,
Yes.
right? Was where you were
Yeah.
planning on going? Right. So it sounds like it was a really an excellent detour.
It was. And I'm out of practice talking. I'm still planning to go to Antarctica. I've got a couple of trips out there. I think it was you, Bill and Claudia, you were the ones who had done Nepal and Tibet and Bhutan, right? Well, I have that one planned for September. In the works. So they had mentioned that this was a great trip that OAT did. And then in May, I'll be taking one of the OAT trips along the Dalmatian coast to Croatia, Slovenia, Albania, and Greece. So
Wonderful. And we look forward to having those programs. I also wondered about what is the relationship with the ancient Egyptian religion and the present day modern times? Is there an active similarity in that religion? Is there vestiges? Is it more historical?
um, that's a complicated question, because now the official religion of Egypt is Islam, and about 90% of the population follows the Islamic faith. About 10% follows or Coptic Christian. There's about 6 to 8 million Christian practitioners. The old religion, as Egypt navigates the modern world, this is a very difficult subject. And the attack on the tourists at Luxor a few years ago, part of that Islamic fundamentalist group that was behind that really wanted to shift away the focus from the early religion, from that, and the tourism that comes to Egypt to look at that. And so it will be an ongoing issue. Egypt's economy depends heavily on tourism. It's the 3rd largest currency earner for the country, and it employs about 30% of the people in the country in tourism related fields. And so that balancing act between faith and
Culture.
the ancient past is one that is a difficult one for Egypt to navigate. And Bill and Claudia, if you want to add anything to that, that was my take on that. It's a tough one.
And so that brings me to, another tough one. which is the presence and seeming ownership of the Rosetta Stone in Great Britain. Um, and in the recent last even couple years, a lot of countries have been moving, including our own, to repatriate stolen artifacts from their cultures, stolen from their countries of origin, their cultures, as things that cannot be taken, that are just simply not somebody else's. And I was thinking about that with the Rosetta Stone. I mean, it's such a powerful, powerful find.
Yeah.
Um, and so important in so many ways. And are is there a chance that it would go back?
For the Rosetta Stone, I'm not sure, but there are a number of museums in recent times have returned artifacts to Egypt. And the United States government just made a major shift of material that was taken from antiquities dealers that had been looted from Egypt back to the country.
Yeah.
The Rosetta Stone is a tough one. I mean, and I, England or Great Britain and their antiquities in the British Museum, of course, are getting attention from a number of different directions because they also have the Elgin marbles there, the ones that were taken from Greece. But the Rosetta Stone had been looted at least twice before it ended up in the Rosetta Fort, where it was built into the side of the wall. And Napoleon had this group of scientists with him. They took a bunch of different artifacts from various things. Part of it was from this attack and conquering of the Rosetta Fort. So then of course they lost it to the British in the battle as they were trying to retreat back to France. So that one I'm sure is going to be a long argument about it.
Yeah.
But other of the artifacts from Egypt, I think, especially the mummies and the human remains, are making their way back home as that becomes a focus of a lot of what museums are trying to convey.
Yeah, and I think just the evolution from a curatorial standpoint, a historical standpoint, but also a cultural one, that we're evolving as a globally as giving these things back or acknowledging where they should live. That is a long journey, but an important one. We have time for another question if anybody would
So
like.
I'm going to dive in right here and introduce Cato to
Oh.
Claudia. Claudia did a lot of work here in our area, in the San Pedro area, with the BLM and in various resource management tasks. And you probably all know people in common.
Claudia, I don't see you on our
Midnight.
screen.
She's
Oh,
It says Bill. This is Claudia.
oh, okay. Well, hello.
Hi, nice to meet you, Cato. It was
Nice
great
to meet-
hear Becky talk about her her involvement and just what was going on. It's been a number of years since we've been down in that area.
Well, we're still working on those issues.
I imagine so.
Yeah.
so.
Thank you, Becky.
Does anybody have one more last comment or question? Well, Becky, once again, thank you for taking us on this journey, documenting your journeys, but giving us the additional historical perspective, and just adding those details. It I think to be informed on that level, that we're not just seeing sites like sightseeing, but really being informed, and adding to our experience, our education, and also, the idea of, yes, we can travel, or where should I take a trip? You can go across the planet. You can go somewhere. And I also really appreciated the distinction of, how COVID has affected these spaces, and it's actually really an interesting thing. Like, there was a movie based on a book called The Beach. And the movie was filmed in, I think, Thailand with Leonardo DiCaprio, and it's a beautiful beach. And the beach became famous, so famous from this movie because it was so visually enticing that it became just overrun with tourists and trampled. And because of COVID, the last 2 years, it has had this remarkable chance to recover its beauty, to come back to that place. And so, in this odd way, these sites that have had huge human gatherings have had also a chance to recover, from that inundation. And I really am just so impressed, to see this venturing out again, but also it's kind of as awful as this pandemic has been, the ability to go to these places with a much smaller imprint is really lucky.
It was. That was one of the most amazing parts of this trip was our little group. Was our small, and that there wasn't the crowds that had been there in the past.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we look forward to your next journeys, and to all it maybe you could just give us a brief update about Camp Naco.
Okay, well, we've got a number of things out there, hopefully for the best. We are in the final state running for 11 most dangerous places in the United States, which would be, if we are chosen for that, it would open us up for major corporate funding. We also are in the running for the governor's recovery funds, ARPA funds, for outdoor recreation and historic preservation. We've been recommended for that by the State Historic Preservation Office, and that could be a grant for major restoration at the site. So we've got our fingers crossed on that. But I was out there yesterday with an engineer in Bisbee, and the grading to get the water away from the foundations is going to start right away. And that's a major step towards preservation. So
That's wonderful.
Excellent.
And just remember, everybody, that there are volunteer opportunities at Camp Naco. Becky does put out the word, and I think Camp Naco has a Facebook page that you can follow. And we hope to do another field trip down there at some point. And so it's just it's our own tiny little piece of really important historical and archaeological history that is now a part of the city of Bisbee under, the city's, I don't know, ownership, but guided caretakership or conservancy. And so, that history from the mammoth to the soldiers and the wars is right here in little Bisbee, Arizona, Naco, Arizona. And so we can explore our own history and go farther afield from our own neighborhood, just a few minutes drive away, and see some amazing things. So thank you, Becky, again, and thank you for preserving our history both here and sharing history from around the world. We are so grateful.
thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, Becky.
It's so good to see everybody.
Thank you.
Evening.
Thank you again.
See you next time.